revalidation for pharmacy professionals. I'm going to tell you today about the kind of functional mechanics of revalidation and also about why it is that we've introduced it, because a lot of the experience of the other regulators who've made changes in this area has been that they to some extent kind of missed the first opportunity to explain why they were introducing their revalidation models or their equivalents of it, and that meant that people got focused on the mechanics rather than the actual reasons why everything was happening. We've designed our model with a lot of learning from how the other regulators have behaved, so hopefully we won't miss that opportunity when it comes to pharmacy, but that'll be kind of the core thing that we'll try and get across to you today, as well as what it is that you actually need to do. But just before we get into kind of the why and the proper mechanics, how many of you have now read the framework for revalidation document that went out in January? You can be honest, don't worry, it doesn't matter if you haven't read it, except for the fact it's 4 years of my work and I spent a really long time producing it. Okay, so the first thing I would say to you all is please do read that document, not just because of the fact it validates my existence as a human being, but also because of the fact that we have tried as much as we can in that relatively brief document to answer all the kinds of questions that you will have. What we haven't done is produced a separate set of FAQs. What we want you to do is to read the document. There are some additional FAQs up on the website, but read the document as a whole and you'll get a real sense of it. I'm going to relate most of what's in that document to you now, and we'll probably pick on some of that in the questions as well, but make sure you read the document. It's something that exists in law as something that you need to meet, so make sure you're familiar with it. Okay, the second question I want to ask you is, how many of you have now done your first time login into my GPhC, the new version of it? Again, be honest, don't worry. So more of you. That's good. Excellent. So now, as of this morning, my numbers tell me that we have 43,000, I think 736 of you out of the roughly 77,000 people on our register who have done their first time login. So we have crossed over the 50% mark a few days ago. And we're fully expecting by the end of the third month of implementation to have 2/3 of you having done that process. It is essential that you do that as soon as possible. That's not because the system hasn't been working for the majority of people, but for some people they've been encountering some unusual quirks related normally to the version of the browser that they're using. So it's important that you find out about that problem before the day of your renewal so that you have some time to update your browsers and find out what updating your browsers means in some cases as well. Please do make an effort to do that. You should have received a letter from us to be able to do that with an activation code in it. If you haven't had that letter, you need to call us. We will not give you that code out over the phone because we're trying to protect your information security, so we'll need to reissue that letter. So as I say, try to do that as soon as you possibly can to make sure that you don't miss out. Okay, are you going to do my slides for me? Thank you. Sorry, just to quickly cover this one, if you do have any questions that you don't want to ask me today, please feel free to email that address there and someone in the organisation will get back to you. At the moment, most queries end up running past my desk, just so you know, so I'll be able to help you out. So the main purpose of revalidation, as I said, to kind of give it about why we're doing this, isn't to assess people. I think there's quite a lot of misunderstandings about what revalidation models are out there to try and achieve, and people often relate them back to the experiences in medicine related to health shipment, and they think that what revalidation models were there to do was to catch the next shipment, whoever that happened to be. And actually that was never the intent behind revalidation models. What they were there to do was to bring people back toward the things that were there during their initial training, but also to help people reflect on their practice. So the main real driver towards revalidation was actually from the Bristol inquiry, where it was clear that people who had passed through their training and been practicing for significant periods of times in medicine had kind of achieved a particular status that meant that very few people were able to question them, and also that their practice had remained the same over the course or similar to what it was at the start of their careers. And it really raised an anxiety amongst many people that there was a part of practice of health professions that meant that some people might keep their practice exactly the same and be unquestionable in that practice as well. And that's what revalidation was kind of set out there to try and do. But actually, it's not necessarily the case that all professions reach that similar level of status, and it's not necessarily the case that the risks are the same as well. But each of the regulators was tasked with the job back in the 90s of coming up with a model for revalidation. And at RPS-GB era, we were doing bits of work to try and work out what that would look like. And then as we moved into GPhC, we started looking at it ourselves. And about 4 years ago, I came along to help take it to the next stage and bring us up to implementation. And over the last 4 years, the main thing we realised was that reflection was the core purpose of revalidation. It wasn't to assess each one of you and find out whether you were safe and fit to practice through this process. It was to drive you all towards a reflective process that was meaningful and valuable. Now, reflection is inherently a subjective, internalised process that we can't particularly prove has occurred or assess. And the only reason why we write it down, a reflection, is to provide evidence that it has happened to a degree, and also to kind of help facilitate some of that reflection. But it's a thought process, it's a personal process. So if you can't assess it, why is a regulator interested in it? Well, because the intent to reflect and improve on your practice is something that gives assurance to members of the public. When asked and unprompted, the things that members of the public say that they want to see from all health professionals, but also specifically when we've asked about pharmacy professionals, is they want to see that you're trying to improve your practice. So that's the thing that gives them the assurance that they're looking for. But they also want to know you're doing that on a regular basis. But the other thing that reflection does, which is actually much more important, is it provides a further opportunity to drive improvement in the system as a whole. And that's about little changes all adding up across each one of you in all of your practice, and that driving improvement collectively. So that's why we do reflection. If I can move on to the next slide. But reflection, we learned over the 4 years, has some characteristics that are absolutely essential for it to be effective. For those of you who are all reflective practitioners, you've been doing it for years as part of the CPD scheme. Does anybody have any idea what some of those characteristics might be? Feel free to just shout them out. It's okay, it's a safe space. There's one at the back.
Normally very personal.
Yeah, that's good. There's an inherently subjective personal nature to reflection. The idea that we can make it wholly objective is actually not an accurate statement at all. And I think sometimes there's been a misapprehension about what reflection is, that it is about bringing something that is subjective into an objective frame. There's an intent to do that, but it can never be fully achieved. Is there anything else? There's a kind of intent to change, at least, as well, in there as well. It's something about looking at your practice with the idea that it could change.
To improve the quality of the service
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's something about some honesty about maybe where you're not doing so well with yourself and potentially with others as well. How well do you think you reflect? Oh, sorry, right at the back.
To do something different.
Yeah, looking for differences, looking for things to be different in future. There's something positive about it as a process. How well do you all think you reflect on a day-to-day basis when you're busy in your pharmacy practice? Not very well, potentially, because when you're busy, it's hard to take the time out to think about what it is that you want your practice to be, or what has just happened. Instead, you're just reacting to the moment. And often when you're just reacting to things in the moment, you're following a kind of behavioural set of tropes that you've already designed, you've been living for years potentially. And there isn't necessarily the space in your mind or in your time to be able to think about how your practice could be different or why it's different. So for us, what we realised was that there were lots of characteristics. There's a lot of clicking next to go on this one. These are just some of the things that we've picked up from. These are all confirmed by academic literature. We talked about time and space here. You need the time and space to be able to think about what your practice could be. You need to be honest with yourself. Sometimes that honesty is supported by information or data that you can collect about your practice. That might be evaluation feedback. It might be about you. It might be about your pharmacy. It might be about the place in which you work. That tends to drive insight, but that's also something people seem to bring to their reflective process as well. They're looking to gain that insight. And really importantly, people need to feel that they're supported. It's almost more important to feel supported than to be supported in the process, because it's a personal process. It's about people feeling like the place where they're working encourages them to reflect on their practice. We've mentioned here about objectivity, and then it's linked to subjectivity as well. This idea it's personal, but we're trying to bring it to a slightly more objective space. Most importantly for many people is that you feel like it's a safe space and it's a trusted space. Probably most of you will know the name Bauer by now. which is the name of a doctor who has been through GMC processes and legal processes around medical manslaughter. And just today there was an announcement that the GMC are going to have some of its powers stripped from them around appealing judgments made by an independent tribunal body that's part of their system of regulation. Because recently they appealed a decision that the government feels undermined the trust in the regulator that the profession had, because of the fact that it didn't acknowledge that there were pressures in the system, and some of the reflections from that doctor, which were surfaced not to actually punish the doctor in any parts of this process, they were surfaced to demonstrate that the doctor had learnt from the events that were happening, were seized upon by other parties and used in some of the litigation against them. And it becomes really important here that when you're reflecting, that you recognise or feel that the environment that you're reflecting within is a safe one, where the reflections will not be used against you. And so we tried to design revalidation, specifically one part of it, to provide you with that safe space, but also to work with the reflections in a way that means that you don't feel like that you're compromising your own ability to be honest, but still learn from where things haven't gone so well. And then linked to that is this idea of respect. The idea is that you respect the process, we respect that process as well, and the reflective process is one that really drives improvement because it's meaningful and it's respected by all the parties. Now, I would argue, probably quite strongly, I think most of you would support me in this one, that the old CPD model wasn't particularly well respected by the majority of you. In fact, it was probably the opposite. In fact, what it did was act as a disincentive for effective reflection. It was extremely full of places for you to be able to reflect. There were buttons for you to press and places for you to write out what those reflections were. But actually what it did was disincentivise you from recording your reflections until such time as you got a letter from us about 6 weeks out from the deadline. You were doing your CPD, you were valuing the CPD, you thought it was the right thing to be doing, but recording it was the last thing you ever wanted to do, and I completely understand that. It's exactly what I would have done if I had a professional responsibility in the same way to do that. It wasn't a system that was incentivising you to record. There were lots of barriers in your way, and that's what we learned when we were doing some of our initial research about CPD, and that's what we've tried to remove as we've designed revalidation. So all of that might sound a bit weird and a bit different when you think about what regulators are here to try and achieve in some of your mindsets, I assume. Some of you are probably thinking, this is all a bit weird, aren't regulators supposed to bash us about the head and tell us that we're doing things badly and that that's what they do, they sometimes strike us off, it's not good. Well, it's all a part of a different way that we've been trying to interact for the last few years, and hopefully you've seen us doing this over the last few years as well. And the first part of it that really landed was the standards for pharmacy professionals. So they were launched in May of last year, but there was a 3-year development process to get us to these standards. They were developed involving members of the public and pharmacy professionals to coalesce and bring together exactly what it is that members of the public and pharmacy professionals believe made up the common core of professional practice in pharmacy. Now, I think it could be easily argued that these standards make up the common core of most health professional practice, in fact all health professional practice. These are the common things that everybody expects from their health professionals in lots of ways, not just pharmacy professionals. Most of them you'll be familiar with. Some we've drawn out differently, but I think you would be familiar with previously. So person-centred care has new primacy within the standards. Previously it was distributed throughout the standards, but it wasn't clearly something that we thought was central to safe and effective practice. As we move round the wheel, partnership working, effective communication, professional knowledge and skills, professional judgment, professional behaviour, I think are all things you would see as being extremely common to your understanding of what it is to be a professional. And those were definitely included within the standards, but perhaps at a more granular level. Then these 3 last areas around the wheel, the last 3 standards, privacy and confidentiality, drawn out in a different way. And just to give you a bit of learning that we had from our evaluation of our standards, of our inspection model, it's supposed to be about 3 years ago, was that we learned there was a difference in perception between members of the public and pharmacy professionals about how well it was that registered pharmacies were meeting the standards around privacy and confidentiality. Pharmacy professionals had higher levels of confidence that they were meeting that standard, as opposed to members of the public who felt like that they weren't getting that space for private and confidential discussions as well. It's just important to note that that doesn't necessarily mean that you weren't meeting that standard, it's about the public perception of how well that standard was met. We know members of the public value privacy and confidentiality greatly, and that's one of the reasons we've built it more clearly into these standards. These last 2 areas then, speaking up about concerns, is from our learning from Mid Staffordshire, where it was clear that the culture within an organisation prevented people from speaking up, and in some cases stopped noticing that there was anything to speak up about anymore, because it just was pointless. There was no point in saying, this doesn't seem right to me, because nobody would have acted, and so people just stopped noticing. And so we thought it was important that there was a separate standard around that. And then effective leadership, just to swing by here, again, not something new, but perhaps the way we're talking about it is different, is this idea of a distributed leadership model where everybody within pharmacy is a leader. That's pharmacist and pharmacy technician. And that leadership role is to each other, but also to the members of the public that you're providing services to as well. Now, those standards are the core of our new approach to regulation. They are the idea that we work with outcomes, that we work in a way that is about recognising the diversity of the pharmacy professionals making up the register, and they sit at the core of the revalidation framework as well. So revalidation then, its function is to support those standards, and it does that by giving you a periodic time to reflect upon some of those standards. But it also serves another function, revalidation, which is to ensure that the trust that's placed in you as pharmacy professionals is well placed. So trust in pharmacy is already tremendously high. Just so you know, pharmacists, rather than pharmacy technicians, because I'm not sure the questions were asked in this way, pharmacists come out as some of the most trusted health professionals that members of the public have. That's two different studies that have confirmed that. Most trusted and most accessible. And that means that you're starting from a really great position. The members of the public value the services that you're providing to them. But trust is easily lost and very hard to win back. And so one of the things we realised we needed to do, based on the way members of the public were talking to us about their expectations about pharmacy professionals do, was look at how we did this. But we also knew we needed to do it differently because of what you had told us about how the CPD system was working as well. And that's what led us to design this 4-part model, which is made up of 2 things that you're utterly familiar with, and then 2 things that will probably seem a bit newer to you. So the first one is the thing in the middle, annual renewal. So you're completely familiar with this, you've been doing it all of this time already. At annual renewal, you make declarations about the fact that you remain safe and effective to practice, and you also pay a fee. But to most of you, it was an administrative burden that you just passed through on an annual basis. If you'd set up a direct debit, you barely noticed that you were doing it as well. Some of you might not have even noticed that if you weren't practicing in the year that was coming and you didn't have an intent to practice, that you might have made a false declaration in some cases as well, because in order to sign that declaration you have to have an intent to practice within Great Britain within the next 12 months. Something that I think has gone largely unnoticed by quite a lot of people on our register, that you should have an intent to practice in the next 12 months. So if you're not practicing in the next 12 months, actually you might want to take a break from the register because you're not expected to be on there for that period. Now, the renewal process as it worked, what we've done and changed about it is that we've made it so that submission of your records for revalidation will take place at the same time as your renewal of registration. And we've broken down the amount that you need to record, instead of it being a 5-year cycle, which acted as a disincentive for you to record, and also meant that many people were recording their reflections across a whole 5-year period in the space of a single weekend. We know that because we asked people and they told us the truth. And it means also that they gave up their weekend as well, which is something I wouldn't do, in order to just stop their lives for a whole weekend and do it that way. It's not valuable to any of us for anybody to be doing that. You're losing time from your real lives, and also you're not necessarily reflecting effectively. It's more important that you do it piecemeal throughout the course of a single year, and it doesn't build up to that level. So now we've changed it to annual submission. CPD, as I've mentioned, we've changed again. We've reduced the amount that you record from 9 entries per year to 4 CPD entries per year. A minimum of those 2 of those must be planned. That means that you will need to have some kind of intent before you've undertaken that learning to have done that learning, that's all. So that might be at the beginning of the year. You know you're going to be offering a new service in your next year's plan, so you're going to go and learn about how that service is delivered. That's a piece of planned learning. And then you can then make up any combination thereafter of those 4 from planned and unplanned learning. Unplanned learning are events that take place where you might identify a gap in your knowledge that then sparks you to go and do a piece of learning, basically. Now, that distinction exists for almost an artificial reason. The reason is, again, there's a difference in perception between what members of the public think about your learning and what you think about your learning. So members of the public cannot understand why unplanned learning is valuable, but pharmacy professionals, and we acknowledge this too, probably find unplanned learning events much more valuable. It's when you suddenly find out, I don't know that, I probably need to go and check that and make sure that this is okay. That's the more valuable learning experience for you. But actually for members of the public, they don't like that. That's a bit worrying for them. They'd rather think that you are planning all your learning, and that's the thing that gives them assurance as well, that you've already forecast what you need to know before you start doing things. So we've wanted to give members of the public that assurance in this system by doing that. Now, you don't need to record as much anymore as well, but you do need to record it in slightly more narrative form. So there's only 2 to 3 boxes to fill in for each learning entry, but you'll need to tell a bit more of a story. Most importantly, you'll need to tell us about the benefit that that learning activity has once it's been applied to the people that use your services. So for most of you in this room, that'll probably be a member of the public, a patient coming into a pharmacy, but for those of you who don't work in that setting, that could be anybody who uses your services. So it might be that it's another colleague working in your environment. It might be that if you're working with a pre-registration trainee, it might be them. Or if you're working in academia, it might be another student. If you're working in industry, it might be another colleague as well. That language of people who use your service is deliberately wide to encompass everybody that you might be providing your services to. Now, with the space that we think we provided, we're adding in 2 new things. I'll get there eventually, don't worry. The peer discussion. This is the one that probably causes the most anxiety to most people, but is also the most powerful new element of the model. This is where we ask you to engage with somebody who understands your practice, who you respect and trust, to have a private conversation where you reflect on your practice. And that means that you can look into the things where you haven't been doing so well as the things that you've been doing well. And it provides you with an opportunity to include someone else about how you can do things differently. Now, it's really important that you select who that person is. Now, they could be another pharmacy professional, but not all of you will find that useful. So it might be another health professional. And in fact, sometimes we're encouraging you to actually go out and think a bit creatively about who that person could be. In some cases, it might not be a health professional as well. Some people have actually told us that they quite value using expert patients. Some people working in very senior management roles are looking for people in similar senior management roles, but from a different discipline. And the same true of people, for example, working in academia as well. The point of this conversation, again, isn't to sign you off or to assess you. It's to encourage that reflection and to give you that safe space. All we ask to be recorded from this is the details of the person, so that if you're selected for review, come on to that later, we can check to make sure the conversation took place. We will never ask what the conversation was about. We just want to check that it took place with that person. And all then we then ask you to record is the benefit that that conversation has had for you and your practice as well. Again, you have to write out that using an applied example. Now, the last part is a reflective account, which is again just another written reflection, and that is related to the standards for pharmacy professionals. Each year, starting in September this year, we're going to tell you which 3 standards of the 9 that we'd ask you to select 1 or more from to reflect upon. Now, we're doing that so that you can demonstrate to us, and therefore to the public, over a period of time that people have reflected on the majority of the standards over a period of time. But the idea here again is we use an applied example from your practice to do that with. Okay. If I move on to the next slide, to explain the mechanics of what it feels like. So there are 6 things to record every year in future, but in this very first year, starting October of this year, the first of you will be asked to submit just 4 CPD records, and everyone who's renewing after the 31st of October for a full year after that will only need to submit 4 CPD records. Basically, there's another year and a bit before you need to start doing or submit your peer discussion and your reflective account, so there's plenty of time to adapt to this new part of the system. There's 4 CPDs to do in your first renewal window, basically, and you'll have about a year to record them. When your renewal window opens, you can then submit those records to us in the new My GPhC. You could have recorded them in My GPhC at any time before then, though. They can sit in the system and you can record more than the minimum number and select from your best, basically, that you want to submit to us. We're also working with partner organisations to try and develop a system so that everybody can actually record their learning somewhere else in the longer term, and then choose each year what they want to submit to us, transfer that to us with a few clicks of a button. That will then be in our system for you then to log into our system, check it, make sure it's all safe, do your declarations, pay your fee, and then renew your registration. Now, once you've submitted records to us, they then move into a pool, and we target people and we select people at random to be able to do the review process. So the reason why we target people is because of how they behaved. If somebody has submitted late, if somebody's had a previous history of struggling with the CPD or revalidation requirements in the past, so been in our remediation process, we're going to ask them to go into the review process. If somebody has tried to drop themselves off the register just before here and then return just here so that they didn't have to submit anything, we're going to ask them to submit their records and we're going to review them definitely. And also, when somebody has a fitness to practice undertaking that's got learning and development activities attached to it, so somebody, for example, has been told to go and do some safeguarding training, we're going to make sure that the safeguarding's been training in the next correct year of their revalidation submission as well. So just joining up what we do at the moment around fitness to practice there. So that's why we target at the moment. In future years we might add more because we want to look at our data and understand better how that might work. So a good example, something I have no evidence to make an assertion about, but it's a good idea for us to investigate this, is that potentially somebody who's not passed the registration assessment 3 times could potentially be less likely to do well at the revalidation process, so we might choose to review them. Actually, I haven't got the data to support that assertion at the moment, but I'm going to start joining that set of data up over time, and if it can be proven, then we can start selecting on that basis, basically. Now, we then would, on top of that sample, and that will probably be around about 300 or 400 people each year, on top of that sample, then do a minimum of 2.5% of the register, which acts more as a baseline and also as an encouragement to let people know we will be checking. We're not actually trying to assess everybody on the register, instead we're just trying to understand how the register is performing using this sample. Now we can increase that sample at any point throughout the year, so it might be the case that if we saw that people weren't meeting the deadlines on time, or it might be that we saw particularly low compliance around this, that we might then send a message that we're going to sample more than 2.5% to everybody on the register, and that will then tell everybody, please do take this seriously because we are going to look at your records, and we can do that any time that we choose. Now, with the review process, what happens is, or rather what happened was previously we had one reviewer, and they may have been a pharmacist, pharmacy technician or a layperson, and they did their review alone. They did it anonymously, so they didn't know who you were, and it made it very difficult for us to quality assure that process and be absolutely certain we were giving out consistent feedback to everybody. Now in part that's because we used that automated feedback report and those automated scores. That gave us the consistency, but it also gave us no tailoring either. And what we want to do is give you more tailored feedback, and we also want to assure the quality of that review process. So we are now having paired reviewers. They'll always be from the right part of the register for you. So for a pharmacy technician, it's going to be a pharmacy technician. If you're a pharmacist, it'll be a pharmacist. And they're always going to be paired with a lay person. We're doing that to make sure that people have the understanding of you, but also they represent the views of the public there. Now their job is to review you against 2 sets of criteria. Actually, one set of criteria is mainly going to be an automatic process because they're very hard measures, very easy to see whether people have met them, and they're called the core criteria. And then there's going to be a second set of criteria called the feedback criteria. The next slides will tell you a bit more about these. Now, everybody who's selected for review will get a tailored report, and everybody on the register will receive bite-sized bits of information about the learning that we're gaining from everybody and their performance in this system. So I'll go on to the next slide, which tells you about what good looks like. So here are the core criteria, paraphrased from what's in the revalidation framework. What you're going to see about these is that they are very easily met. It's very easy to see whether they're met. They are definitive things. So, are they submitted on time? Are there enough of them compared to what we asked you to submit? Are they really a true and accurate record of your learning? Have you submitted them and have you chosen to do that? Now many of those are actually there for the very rare circumstances that we find out that somebody has fraudulently made submissions. And just to let you know, that was something that came out in our consultation from members of the pharmacy professions telling us that it was a big deal, but actually our experience has been that in the CPD processes this is a very rare event for us to see. So actually our focus has been much more on the next set of criteria, the feedback criteria, but these are the core ones. So everybody is expected to meet these. If you don't meet these, what happens is that you go automatically into our remediation process, which is you get another go at trying to meet these requirements. If you don't meet them then, you then move into a process which has many steps in it called our administrative removal from the register process, which is 2 points in it at which you can essentially provide representation, stroke appeal the decision, and be able to access the register again. Just so you know, in our old CPD system, we were talking about an absolute minority of people ever on the register encountering this problem. 99.9% of everybody on the register was able to pass through the process. 99.7% of the register were able to pass through the process on their first attempt, so without needing any remedial measures, just so you know. So actually, these criteria haven't really changed since that time. They are hard, solid, measurable things. Moving on to the next slide, we go on to the feedback criteria, and I focused here just on the peer discussion because it's the one that people tend to find a bit more frightening. And the peer discussion are difficult to measure. They're quite amorphous, and for that reason they don't lead to people being removed from the register. They are there to help us drive improvement in the system, to help you improve the way that you reflect. And so they are written out in such a way that means that our reviewers will be able to give you feedback on them. These again are all written out in the revalidation framework document. These are exact excerpts there. So what we're looking for a good peer discussion, and the way that it's written up, is that there's information about why you chose your peers. So why was that the person that you selected, and why is that relevant to the practice that you're doing or the thing that you wanted to reflect upon? And then we want you to write a description of how the process of peer discussion has benefited your practice, and then by extension how that has benefited the people that you determine to be your service users. And then most importantly, we want an example. Now this is true of all of the revalidation records. They are about application of the learning from the CPD, the peer discussion and the reflective account. We need to see real events being written about here. So there's no more hypothetical types of entries that were being made. So some of you have probably heard me say this before if you've been at any of the presentations. The way that CPD used to work was that many people just used to say, I've read a journal, I now have more knowledge in my head, which hypothetically means I'm a better pharmacist, which means hypothetically that people will be doing better. And actually we don't want to see those hypothetical examples. What we want instead is to see you having applied some learning. And that's one of the reasons we reduced the amount of entries that we ask you to record each year, because we've wanted to increase the chances that you'd have more good applied learning in the course of the year as well. So just moving on to the next slide, what you'll see here is an actual example of an anonymised peer discussion. Now I'm in the midst of producing around about 44 examples for people in different types of roles and settings of practice. This is someone who's working in industry, who chose as their peer the person who was supervising them through their qualified persons education process. And this person was coaching them already. They identified a peer from someone they knew already, and they were coaching them around answering questions. And what that coaching process did for this particular person was it actually allowed them to start thinking about their communication style. So they were being coached to be able to answer examination questions better in mock oral examinations. But what it started to was have an impact on the way that they were working. So the people who used their services were the people that they were working around them, and it meant that they were better able, and the evidence that they got and the applied examples is that they were starting to get feedback about how well they were doing when they were explaining things to people and responding to the queries. Now what you can see, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, is that this is all quite small. Nobody changed the world particularly when they were doing this, but what it did was it drove them towards a small improvement in their practice, and that's what we want to see. We're not looking for you to provide peer-reviewed evidence of the improvement that you've made to the local community's health, but actually to talk about particular instances or examples where the benefit of your learning or your peer discussion or your meeting the standards has been evident, and that you can provide us with an example of it. So that's what we're looking for. It doesn't actually, hopefully to most of you, seem that difficult now. The other thing you'll notice is it's about 200-300 words. And what we found from our pilot study was that was about the right length for most people to be able to do these reflections effectively. I've actually been editing down most of the real life examples because many people used a lot more words to be able to do these things. So I'm actually shortening them from what most people are doing. So people tend to write about 600-700 words, and you can do it in less if you want to. Okay. So just to briefly go over how it was that we got here, as I say, it's been about 4 years worth of work, and we started off with a kind of pure research and development period where what we were trying to do was to understand what you were already doing, what you already thought about the CPD process, and what we found out was that you didn't really like it, although some of you I believe had Stockholm syndrome and really loved it and thought it was the best thing that ever happened, and a few of them are still clinging on to that idea, even though actually from an educational point of view it was quite flawed. What we also learnt was that there were lots of things that people were doing already, and so we built the model with that in mind, and we tested a model in 2015 with about 240 volunteers of the things we thought you were already doing that could possibly work towards this. From that learning we then designed a pilot study with 1,300 people who were initially enrolled in it. Actually only 800 people then participated fully in that process, and then we spent some time independently evaluating that with an organisation called Solutions for Public Health, who are based in a CCG, and all of that work led us to, in collaboration with the sector, with a group we called the advisory group, made up of more than 30 organisations representing pharmacy professionals, their employers and patients. We then went to consult last year Consultation, let me think, I think it was 1,800 responses to the consultation that we received, and it was very high levels of agreement with the processes that we were suggesting, but also some suggestions for changes. A couple of things just to highlight to you that we did change. So the first thing is on the peer discussion. We were originally thinking we didn't want to say anything about whether peer discussions should be part of appraisal, because we thought we wanted to leave that to people. And actually we're making a recommendation that it probably shouldn't be a part of an appraisal process. It should be something different. It might take place at the same time. It might be that your line manager is your peer, but it can't be an allocated peer. Your employer can't choose who your peer is. You have to choose, and it needs to be a separate discussion that isn't related necessarily to your performance as such, and much more about a reflective discussion about you rather than your performance. Another example of a change we made was that we originally said we would keep records in our system for 1 year, no, 18 months it was, and the reason we're just to be clear about that is that we as a regulator can only keep your records for as long as we can possibly review them. And what we found out from the consultation was that some people had an anxiety that if we didn't keep the records for a little bit longer, there would be some people who just submit the same records each year. And so we're keeping them for longer so that we'll be able to match across 3 years worth of records to make sure that they're different, basically. Again, that wasn't actually an anxiety that we had in the organisation, it was one that you reported back to us, so we decided to change how we were keeping the records for you. Just so you know, trust for pharmacy professionals is very high, but trust within pharmacy professionals is quite low. A little bit low. The other thing that we also made a change to was how the reflective account worked, because originally we were going to say, to be easy on everybody, that there'd be just one standard to reflect upon each year, but some of you were concerned that what might happen is that you wouldn't have an example that was relevant for that year, so you wanted to be able to select from a wider range of standards. That is something that isn't actually necessarily specified or documented in the mechanics of how the system works, so we can make that easier or for people as time goes on, make small changes. So just move on to the next slide very quickly to just let you say, to remind you again what's happening. So we launched in April. You have an updated version of My GPhC right now. Please do your first time login as soon as possible. There's new guidance, there's examples going up. We have specific guidance for the peer discussion. That's for you, for your peer, and for your employers as well, if you want to have that as well. What you should be doing now is getting logged in, getting used to the new system, getting used to the idea of what the new format of CPD records look like, and then starting from the first renewal that you do under the new arrangements. Once you've submitted your 4 CPD records to us, start thinking about who your peer is going to be for the next year for your submission, because that's going to be the thing that takes some time to organise if you haven't already decided who that peer is going to be. Just to highlight there, reciprocal peer discussions are possible, but make sure you give each other the time. So you can have a discussion that is your peer is also you're their peer and they're your peer, but it needs to be 2 separate discussions. You need to give it the time that it deserves. And just the last slide, I think it is, which is evaluation. So just to let you know that then what happens now is that the process is fixed because we've consulted upon it, but we're not done, and that means that what we'll be doing is evaluating from now on. So my work is basically about supporting the implementation, but also designing the evaluation strategy now. So in the shorter term, our evaluation will be to start asking you, and we'll be sending out invitations to ask what you're thinking and feeling about the process. That won't be for a few months yet, because actually you need to try it out before we start asking you. But then in the longer term, what we want to start doing, and this will be the first time we think one of the regulators has been able to do this, is actually start looking at what your reflections are saying about the benefit that these things are having, on the people who use your services. And if we can look at that information and process it properly, we might be able to show you for the first time how reflective practice is having a more direct impact on the people who are using services. So that's quite an interesting and new part of how evaluation of revalidation models might work if you happen to be a regulation geek like me. The other thing that might do is means we make small changes to the model. So it might be that we find out that something like the 3 standards each year isn't working, and actually we need to tell you select from the 9 or something like that. We can just make a change like that so that it's easier for people to engage. But what we might also find out are bigger changes that we want to make. This again is not a confirmation of something we want to do, but in the consultation we heard that some people wanted a 360-degree model of feedback to be embedded within the system and mandatory for everyone. It wasn't a lot of people who said it, but when they said it very loudly. And so one of the things that we're thinking about as an idea for the future, but not for now, is that if we found out that that was feasible and that was something that really did benefit members of the public, would that be something that we wanted to introduce? It's something that's in the medical model, and it's something that the nursing model aspired to do as well. But it's not something that's in our model at the moment. It might be over time that we find out that that's something we want to include as well. But again, we would have evidence for that. In the same way as before, we would need to know that it works, we need to pilot, we need to consult on all of those things as well. Okay, I think that's the last one. So if there are any questions?